Hey guys, tonight we're going to the very edge of a world where gods once ruled from marble thrones high above the clouds, where lightning could fall from the hand of Zeus, and a single word from Apollo could decide a man's fate. But like all empires, even the gods had their final days. Before we begin, if you enjoy quiet, dark stories from the past, you can support the channel with a free subscription. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I read every comment. It's always wild to see people tuning in from all over the world. Now, take a breath and settle in. This is Myth Night, where you relax and I tell you true stories from the forgotten past. And if you fall asleep before the end, that's okay. Some stories were made to be finished in dreams. The torches that once burned eternal in Zeus's temples flickered in the mountain wind, their flames growing weaker with each passing season. Across the ancient world, something profound was shifting, something that even the all-seeing gods themselves might not have fully understood. The golden age that had lasted for over 1,000 years was drawing to a close, not with the clash of divine warfare or cosmic catastrophe, but with something far more subtle and perhaps more final, the quiet turning away of human hearts. In the marble halls of Olympus, where laughter and argument had once echoed through eternity, a strange silence was beginning to settle. The gods still ruled from their cloud-wreathed peaks, still sent their signs and wonders into the mortal world below. But fewer eyes turned skyward to read those signs. Fewer voices called out in prayer. Fewer hands left offerings at the temple doors. The priests who tended the sacred fires noticed it first. The quality of devotion was changing, becoming something more formal, more distant. Where once worshippers had come with desperate need and passionate gratitude, now they arrived with duty and tradition. The gods were becoming customs rather than living presences, stories rather than the breathing, passionate beings who had once walked among mortals in disguise. This wasn't happening all at once, like the sudden fall of Troy or the overnight transformation of a hero into a constellation. Instead, it was occurring with the patient inevitability of seasons changing, of mountains slowly wearing down to hills, of rivers gradually carving new channels through ancient stone. The gods were experiencing something they had never faced before, not death, which was impossible for immortal beings, but something perhaps worse, the slow fade of relevance. In the great library of Alexandria, scholars were beginning to speak of the old myths in new ways. Instead of recounting the deeds of Zeus as historical fact, they analyzed them as poetry. Instead of consulting Athena's wisdom through prayer, they sought knowledge through reason and observation. The stories that had once explained thunder and earthquake, love and war, birth and death, were becoming objects of study rather than sources of truth. The mystery cults that had once offered deeper communion with the divine were finding fewer initiates. The oracle at Delphi, whose pronouncements had shaped the fate of kingdoms, spoke to smaller crowds. The great festivals that had drawn pilgrims from across the Mediterranean were becoming more about tradition and spectacle than genuine religious fervor. Yet the gods themselves seemed almost unaware of what was happening. From their perspective, mortal lives flickered past like candle flames, brief, bright, then gone. The worship of individuals might wax and wane, but the eternal patterns of human need and divine response had seemed as fixed as the movement of stars. They had weathered periods of doubt before, had seen empires rise and fall while their temples remained. But this time was different. This time, the change wasn't coming from war or conquest or natural disaster. It was coming from within the human spirit itself. a growing confidence that mortals could understand their world without divine explanation, could find meaning without divine purpose, could face the future without divine protection. The irony was profound and would not have been lost on the gods who had always appreciated the complex workings of fate. The very gifts they had given to humanity, the fire of knowledge that Prometheus had stolen, the capacity for reason that Athena had nurtured, the artistic vision that Apollo had inspired, were now leading mortals away from the need for gods altogether. Philosophy was replacing mythology as the way educated people understood the cosmos. Science was beginning to explain phenomena that had once required divine intervention. Human law was taking precedence over divine command. The gods had succeeded so well in raising humanity that their children no longer needed them in the old ways. In the countryside, where change came more slowly, old women still left bread and wine at crossroads for Hecate. Farmers still watched the sky for Zeus's mood before planting. Sailors still poured libations into the wine-dark sea for Poseidon's favor. But even these ancient practices were beginning to feel like echoes of something that was slipping away, like songs whose melodies were remembered, but whose meaning was growing dim. The great temples that had been the beating hearts of Greek cities were still magnificent, still drew crowds for festivals and ceremonies, but they were increasingly becoming museums of their own tradition rather than living centers of divine encounter. The marble gods gazed down with the same perfect beauty they had always possessed, but somehow the gaze seemed more distant, as if the divine presence was already beginning to withdraw from these earthly forms. This was how the end began, not with apocalypse, but with awakening, not with divine wrath, but with human wisdom, not with the death of gods, but with their slow transformation from living powers into eternal stories. The age of mythology wasn't ending with a bang, but with the gentle closing of a book, as humanity turned the page to a new chapter in its long journey toward understanding. Long before the scholars in Alexandria began treating the gods as literary subjects, the signs of coming change had been written in the old prophecies themselves. The Greeks, who believed that fate could be foreseen even if it couldn't be avoided, had always known that their golden age would not last forever. Hidden within their own mythology were the seeds of its eventual transformation. The oracle at Delphi, that sacred cave where Apollo's priestess had delivered the will of the gods for over 8 centuries, began to speak in riddles that pointed toward the twilight of divine rule. Her prophecies, always cryptic, grew darker and more ominous as the centuries passed. Where once she had guided heroes to glory and warned kings of disaster, now her words seemed to hint at changes that would affect the gods themselves. When mortals cease to dream of immortals, the immortals shall dream of mortality, she whispered to a philosopher who had come seeking wisdom about the nature of the divine. The meaning was unclear then, but it would become evident in time. As humans grew less dependent on gods, the gods themselves would become more like the humans they had once guided. The Sibylline books, those ancient prophecies that Rome had inherited from Greek tradition, spoke of a time when the temples of the old shall become theaters for the new, and that which was worshipped shall become that which is merely remembered. Roman priests who consulted these texts found references to great changes coming from the East, to new ideas that would sweep across the world like a cleansing fire. Even more disturbing were the reports that began filtering in from across the Greek world. Statues in temples were found weeping tears of blood, their marble faces expressing sorrows that no human hand had carved. The sacred fires that had burned continuously for centuries suddenly guttered out despite being tended by faithful priests. Oracles fell silent mid-prophecy, their divine inspiration seemingly withdrawn without warning. In the theater of Dionysus at Athens, actors performing the old religious dramas reported strange experiences. Masks that had been used for generations to portray the gods began to crack during performances, splitting along lines that seemed to follow expressions of infinite sadness. The plays themselves, written to honor the gods and explore divine justice, began to feel more like elegies than celebrations. Natural omens appeared with increasing frequency. Solar eclipses, traditionally interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, came in unusual patterns that the wisest seers struggled to understand. Earthquakes struck not randomly, but seemed to target the greatest temples first, as if the earth itself was rejecting the divine foundations that had been built upon it. The sacred groves where gods had once been said to walk among mortals began to wither without apparent cause. Ancient oak trees that had stood for centuries, their branches heavy with the offerings of countless pilgrims, dropped their leaves out of season and refused to bloom when spring arrived. Springs that had been considered holy since time immemorial ran dry, their waters disappearing as mysteriously as divine presence itself. Birds that had long served as messengers of the gods began to change their flight patterns. Eagles, sacred to Zeus, were seen flying in circles above his temples as if confused or lost. Owls, Athena's companions, gathered in unprecedented numbers at the Parthenon, their hooting creating a haunting chorus that seemed to mourn something that had not yet been fully lost. The priests and priestesses who served in the temples began to report disturbing dreams. Night after night, they found themselves visited by visions of empty thrones, of divine halls where no voices spoke, of Olympus itself slowly fading like a mirage in the desert heat. These dreams were so vivid and so consistent across different temples and different regions that they could not be dismissed as mere anxiety or imagination. Most unsettling of all were the reports of gods themselves appearing to their most faithful servants with messages of farewell. These divine visitations, once occasions of joy and terror, now carried an overwhelming sense of melancholy. Athena was said to have appeared to her high priestess in Athens, her gray eyes filled with sadness that seemed to encompass all of time. The age of direct divine rule draws to a close, she reportedly said, her voice carrying the weight of infinite wisdom and infinite loss. But do not mourn, for what we have given to humanity will live on in forms we cannot yet imagine. We are not dying, we are changing, as all things must change when their time has come. Apollo, god of prophecy, delivered perhaps the most profound omen of all when he spoke through his oracle at Delphi, for what many believe was the last time in the old manner. His message was both prophecy and explanation, both warning and comfort. The age of asking gods for answers ends when mortals learn to find answers within themselves. We do not abandon you. You graduate from needing us as you once did. These omens and prophecies painted a picture of transformation rather than destruction. The gods were not being defeated or overthrown as the Titans had been. Instead, they were experiencing something entirely new in the cosmos, planned obsolescence. They had succeeded so well in their role as humanity's teachers and guides that their students no longer needed them in the same way. The most perceptive priests and philosophers began to understand that they were witnessing not the end of the gods, but their metamorphosis. Like butterflies emerging from chrysalises, the divine powers were preparing to take new forms, to influence human affairs in ways that would be less direct, but perhaps more profound than the old methods of thunderbolts and miraculous interventions. But understanding the nature of the change didn't make it less painful for those who had devoted their lives to the old ways. As the omens multiplied and the prophecies grew clearer, the faithful prepared themselves for a world where the gods would still exist, but would no longer answer when called by name. As the old gods began their gradual withdrawal from direct involvement in human affairs, new forces were already stirring in the intellectual and spiritual landscape of the ancient world. These weren't divine powers in the traditional sense, but they would prove just as capable of capturing human imagination and reshaping entire civilizations. The first challenge to the Olympian order came not from foreign conquerors, but from within Greek culture itself. Philosophers like Xenophanes began to question the very nature of divine anthropomorphism, arguing that humans had created gods in their own image rather than the other way around. If horses could draw, he observed, they would draw their gods as horses. This simple statement planted seeds of doubt that would grow for centuries. Socrates, though he claimed to serve a divine mission, introduced ideas that would gradually undermine traditional religious authority by insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that wisdom came through questioning rather than accepting established truths. He encouraged a way of thinking that made divine revelation seem less necessary. His student Plato would go even further, proposing that the material world itself was merely a shadow of higher truths that could be reached through reason. Aristotle completed this philosophical revolution by creating a system of understanding the natural world that required no direct divine intervention. His concept of natural laws, operating according to their own internal logic, provided explanations for phenomena that had previously required the immediate attention of gods. Thunder didn't need Zeus. It could be understood as a natural acoustic phenomenon. Earthquakes didn't require Poseidon's anger. They resulted from movements in the Earth's structure. Meanwhile, from the east, new religious ideas were beginning to penetrate the Greek world. Mystery religions promised direct personal relationships with divine powers that didn't require the complex rituals and priestly intermediaries of traditional Olympic worship. The cult of Mithras, popular among soldiers, offered salvation through personal devotion rather than community sacrifice. The worship of Isis provided emotional comfort and personal protection that many found more satisfying than the distant majesty of Olympian gods. These Eastern religions shared certain characteristics that made them appealing to people who were growing dissatisfied with traditional mythology. They emphasized personal salvation over civic duty, individual relationship with divinity over community ritual, and moral transformation over ritual purity. They offered hope for afterlife rewards that were based on personal merit rather than social status or divine favoritism. But perhaps the most significant challenge to Greek mythology came from an unexpected source, Rome itself. As Roman power expanded across the Mediterranean, it brought with it a very different understanding of divine authority. Roman gods were more closely tied to the state, more focused on practical matters of governance and law, less concerned with the complex family dramas and personal passions that characterized Greek mythology. When Romans encountered Greek gods, they didn't reject them entirely. Instead, they absorbed them into their own system, identifying Zeus with Jupiter, Athena with Minerva, Aphrodite with Venus. But in the process of translation, something essential was lost. The rich narratives and complex personalities that had made Greek gods so compelling were simplified into more functional roles. The gods became administrators of cosmic order rather than the passionate, flawed, intensely personal beings they had been in Greek imagination. This Roman interpretation of Greek mythology would prove to be both preservation and transformation. Roman poets like Ovid would retell the old stories with magnificent artistry, ensuring their survival for future generations. But they told them as literature rather than as religious truth, as entertainment rather than as explanation of cosmic reality. The Roman approach to religion was fundamentally different from the Greek. Where Greeks had seen their gods as complex individuals with their own desires and motivations, Romans tended to view divinity as a force to be properly managed through correct ritual and legal obligation. This bureaucratic approach to the divine gradually replaced the more emotional and personal relationships that had characterized Greek religious practice. As Roman influence spread, local temples were rebuilt in Roman styles with Roman interpretations of divine hierarchy. Greek priests found themselves adapting their practices to conform to Roman expectations. The old flexibility and local variation that had characterized Greek worship gave way to more standardized empire-wide religious practices. But the most revolutionary change was yet to come. From the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, a new religious movement was spreading with unprecedented speed and power. Christianity offered something that neither traditional Greek mythology nor Roman state religion could provide: the promise of universal salvation through divine love rather than divine power. The Christian message was radical in ways that went far beyond theology. It suggested that all humans, regardless of social status, could have direct access to divine grace. It promised that suffering had meaning and that death was not final. It offered a personal relationship with a God who had experienced human suffering and understood human weakness. Most challenging to the old order, Christianity claimed exclusive truth. Unlike the traditional Mediterranean approach to religion, which had always been willing to add new gods to existing pantheons, Christianity insisted that all other gods were either false or demonic. This wasn't religious competition, it was religious war. The early Christian apologists, like Justin Martyr and Origen, developed sophisticated arguments for why Greek mythology should be abandoned. They argued that the stories of gods committing adultery, theft, and murder were morally corrupting. They suggested that demons had impersonated gods to lead humans astray. They claimed that whatever truth existed in pagan philosophy had been borrowed from Hebrew scriptures or had been planted by divine providence to prepare the way for Christian revelation. These new powers, philosophical rationalism, mystery religions, Roman imperial organization, and Christian monotheism, didn't attack Greek mythology directly. Instead, they gradually made it irrelevant. They offered alternative ways of understanding the world that seemed more satisfying, more practical, or more morally elevated than the old stories of quarreling gods and their complicated relationships with mortals. The transformation was so gradual that many people barely noticed it happening. A merchant might still pour wine into the sea for Poseidon's favor while also wearing an amulet to Mithras and attending philosophical lectures that explained storms as natural phenomena. A Roman senator might participate in traditional religious ceremonies while privately believing that the gods were metaphors for natural forces or social ideals. But each generation found the old stories a little less compelling, a little more distant from their actual concerns and experiences. The gods who had once seemed vitally present in every aspect of human life were slowly being relegated to the realm of poetry and nostalgia. As the ancient world transformed around them, the gods themselves seemed to sense that their time of direct rule was coming to an end. The last myths to emerge from authentic Greek religious tradition weren't stories of divine triumph or cosmic drama, but rather tales of withdrawal, transformation, and farewell. These final stories carried a melancholy beauty that reflected both the grandeur of what was passing away and the inevitability of change. The story of Zeus's final council has been preserved in fragments by late poets who claim to have received it from the last oracles of Dodona. According to this account, the king of the gods gathered his divine family one last time in the great hall of Olympus, its crystal walls reflecting the light of a sun that seemed somehow dimmer than in ages past. "My children," Zeus reportedly said, his voice carrying the weight of eons, "the time has come for us to step back from the world we have shaped. Humanity has grown beyond the need for our direct guidance. They have learned to find thunder's source in the collision of clouds, to trace love's origin to the human heart, to discover justice in their own capacity for reason and compassion." Athena, goddess of wisdom, was said to have responded with words that became prophecy. "We do not die, Father. We transform. Our stories will live in human hearts long after our temples crumble. Our truths will find new expressions in languages not yet born. What we have planted in mortal souls will bloom in gardens we will never see." Poseidon, lord of the seas, spoke of his growing preference for the deep ocean trenches where no human eyes would ever look, where he could exist in the elemental state that preceded his anthropomorphic form. The sailors' offerings still reached him, he said, but they felt more like memories than prayers, more like echoes of connection than active communication. Apollo, who had been humanity's guide to art and music, prophecy, and healing, described his plan to withdraw his oracles gradually, letting human inspiration take their place. "I will not abandon them," he explained, "but I will work through their own voices now. When they create beauty, they will feel my touch. When they seek truth, they will find my guidance. But they will call it their own genius, their own insight, and they will be right." Artemis spoke of retreating deeper into wilderness areas where human civilization would never penetrate, becoming once again the pure spirit of untamed nature that she had been before cities were built. She would continue to protect wild creatures and guard the boundaries between civilized and primal existence, but mortals would know her only as an instinct to preserve what was ancient and free. The goddess Demeter described her intention to work entirely through natural processes, no longer appearing as a divine figure, but becoming indistinguishable from the earth's own fertility. Harvests would still depend on her blessing, but farmers would understand the blessing as soil chemistry and weather patterns, genetic inheritance, and ecological balance. Hera, despite her often contentious relationship with Zeus, spoke with deep dignity about her role as protector of marriage and family. She would continue to bless unions that were based on genuine love and mutual respect, she said, but her influence would be felt as emotional wisdom rather than divine intervention. Couples would succeed or fail based on their own choices, though her guidance would still be available to those who looked for it in their own hearts. Aphrodite laughed as she described her plans, her laughter like silver bells that could make even grief seem beautiful. Love, she pointed out, had never really required divine enforcement. Humans had always been perfectly capable of falling in love without her direct intervention. She would simply become what she had always truly been, the recognition that beauty and attraction were among the most powerful forces in the universe. Ares spoke little, as was his nature, but what he said was profound. War, he noted, had always brought out both the worst and the best in mortals. He would step back and allow them to discover for themselves that courage and honor were internal qualities, that the strength needed for both conflict and peace came from within. His influence would remain in the human capacity for righteous anger and protective violence, but it would no longer bear his name. Hephaestus, the craftsman god, smiled as he spoke of his delight in human technical progress. Every invention, every tool that made life easier or more beautiful was a form of worship that pleased him more than any burnt offering ever had. He would continue to inspire creativity and innovation, but through human ingenuity rather than divine revelation. Hermes, the messenger and guide, described his evolving role as facilitator of communication and travel. As trade routes expanded and languages evolved, as human messengers and merchants carried ideas across vast distances, he would be present in every successful negotiation, every safe journey, every moment when strangers found common ground. Even Hades, who rarely left his underground realm, sent word through Hermes about his intentions. Death, he pointed out, had always been the most human of experiences. Gods could experience loss and sorrow, but only mortals faced the absolute finality that gave their choices an ultimate meaning. He would continue to receive the dead with justice and compassion, but he would allow humans to develop their own understanding of what lay beyond life. The last myth tells of how the gods agreed to place their essential powers into dormancy rather than abandoning them entirely. Like seeds in winter soil, their influence would remain in the world, but in forms that humans might not recognize as divine. They would work through inspiration rather than intervention, through natural law rather than miraculous exception, through human wisdom rather than external revelation. Zeus was said to have given his final pronouncement from the throne that had been the center of cosmic authority for millennia. We withdraw not in defeat, but in victory. We have succeeded so completely in our role as teachers that our students have surpassed the need for constant instruction. From now on, they will find us not in the sky above, but in the depths within. The last genuine religious poetry to emerge from the Greek tradition speaks of the gods departing not in anger or sorrow, but with something approaching parental pride. They had raised humanity from primitive superstition to philosophical sophistication, from tribal warfare to complex civilization, from helpless dependence to creative independence. These final myths weren't endings, but transformations. The gods weren't dying. They were evolving into something that could exist in a world where human reason had become powerful enough to explain natural phenomena and human wisdom, sophisticated enough to grapple with moral complexity without external commands. As these last stories spread through the Hellenistic world, they provided a framework for understanding the religious changes that thoughtful people could see happening around them. The gods weren't being overthrown by new deities or abandoned by ungrateful mortals. They were completing their mission and moving on to whatever comes next for beings whose existence transcends the cycles of worship and neglect that affect mortal institutions. As the gods began their gradual withdrawal from direct governance of human affairs, mortals found themselves inheriting responsibilities they had never imagined they could handle alone. For centuries, every major decision had involved consulting oracles. Every crisis had called for divine intervention. Every triumph had been attributed to divine favor. Now, slowly but inexorably, humans were discovering that they possessed within themselves the wisdom and strength they had always sought from above. The change was most visible in the realm of natural philosophy, what we would now call science. Thales of Miletus shocked his contemporaries by predicting a solar eclipse through mathematical calculation rather than divine revelation. His student Anaximander created the first map of the known world based on observation and logical deduction rather than mythological geography. These weren't just intellectual achievements, they were declarations of independence from the need for supernatural explanation. In the medical schools, established by followers of Hippocrates, a new understanding of disease was emerging. Where previous generations had seen illness as divine punishment or demonic possession, these healers began to identify natural causes and natural cures. The Hippocratic Oath famously stated that physicians should help, or at least do no harm, making healing a human responsibility rather than a divine gift to be passively received. The transformation was equally dramatic in the realm of ethics and justice. Solon's legal reforms in Athens established the principle that laws should be based on human reason and social necessity rather than divine command. His famous statement that nothing in excess should guide human behavior drew on traditional Greek wisdom, but placed the responsibility for moral choice squarely on human shoulders. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle developed increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding right and wrong without reference to divine will. And Plato's Republic imagined an ideal society based entirely on human wisdom and rational organization. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics argued that virtue could be cultivated through human practice and reflection, that the good life was achievable through personal effort and social cooperation. The arts, too, began to reflect this new human-centered worldview. Earlier Greek drama had focused on the interactions between gods and mortals, with divine intervention often providing resolution to human conflicts. But the later plays of Euripides increasingly portrayed humans solving their own problems through courage, cleverness, and moral choice. The gods still appeared in these dramas, but often as distant figures whose relevance to human concerns was questionable. Architecture and sculpture evolved to celebrate human achievement rather than just divine glory. The Parthenon, ironically one of the last great temples built in classical Athens, was as much a celebration of Athenian democracy and artistic achievement as it was a house for Athena's worship. The sculptures that adorned it showed humans at their most noble and capable, suggesting that mortals were worthy subjects for artistic attention in their own right. Historical writing emerged as a discipline that sought to understand human events through human causes. Herodotus, often called the father of history, certainly included divine elements in his accounts, but he focused primarily on human motivations, cultural differences, and political developments. Thucydides went even further, explicitly rejecting supernatural explanations for the Peloponnesian War and analyzing it purely in terms of human ambition, fear, and miscalculation. The change was perhaps most profound in the realm of personal spirituality. The mystery religions that gained popularity during this period promised direct personal experience of the divine without the mediation of traditional priests or the performance of complex public rituals. Initiates into the Eleusinian mysteries, the cult of Dionysus, or the worship of Mithras sought transformation through personal discipline and private revelation rather than community worship and civic ceremony. Philosophy itself became a kind of spiritual practice. The Stoics developed techniques for achieving inner peace and moral strength through rational self-examination and acceptance of natural law. The Epicureans sought happiness through understanding the nature of desire and learning to find satisfaction in simple pleasures. These philosophical schools offered practical wisdom for living well without requiring belief in anthropomorphic gods or dependence on divine intervention. Educational systems began to emphasize human rather than divine knowledge. The academy that Plato established in Athens taught mathematics, dialectics, and natural philosophy as paths to understanding reality. The Lyceum where Aristotle taught focused on empirical observation and logical analysis. These institutions produced generations of thinkers who were comfortable seeking truth through human methods rather than waiting for divine revelation. Trade and commerce expanded the Greek worldview beyond the traditional boundaries of divine oversight. Merchants traveling to Egypt, Persia, India, and other distant lands encountered different gods, different explanations for natural phenomena, different moral systems. This exposure to cultural diversity made it harder to maintain that Greek mythology represented the only valid understanding of cosmic reality. The conquests of Alexander the Great accelerated this process of cultural exchange and intellectual synthesis. Greek ideas about philosophy, science, and governance spread across the known world, but they also encountered and absorbed influences from other traditions. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's death was characterized by cosmopolitan cities where Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and other cultural elements blended into new forms. Mathematics emerged as a universal language that transcended cultural differences. Euclid's geometry worked the same way in Alexandria as in Athens, suggesting that some forms of truth were accessible to human reason regardless of local religious traditions. Archimedes' mechanical innovations demonstrated that humans could harness natural forces through understanding rather than supplication. Even in areas where divine influence was still acknowledged, the relationship was changing. Athletes still dedicated their victories to gods, but they also recognized the role of training, diet, and technique. Farmers still prayed for good weather, but they also developed improved planting methods and crop rotation systems. Soldiers still sought divine protection, but they also studied tactics and strategy. This gradual assumption of responsibility for their own fate didn't make humans arrogant or irreligious. Rather, it seemed to inspire a deeper appreciation for the complexity and mystery of existence. As they learned more about the natural world, they became more rather than less amazed by its intricacy and beauty. As they took greater responsibility for their moral choices, they became more rather than less aware of the difficulty of living ethically. The transition from divine to human authority was neither complete nor uniform. Traditional religious practices continued alongside new philosophical approaches. Many people combined rational analysis with spiritual practices, seeking practical solutions to immediate problems while maintaining belief in ultimate mysteries beyond human understanding. But the fundamental shift was unmistakable. Humans were discovering that they possessed the capacity to understand their world, to make moral choices, to create beauty, to solve problems, and to find meaning without constant divine guidance. The gods had succeeded so completely in their role as teachers that their students were ready to graduate to independence. The transformation of Greek mythology from living religion to cultural memory didn't happen through conquest or persecution, but through a gradual process that was both more subtle and more complete than any military defeat could have achieved. Like a great tree dying from within, while its exterior remained impressive, the mythological system maintained its outward forms long after its spiritual substance had begun to fade. The first temples to fall into disuse weren't destroyed by enemies, but simply abandoned by congregations who no longer felt the need for their services. In remote rural areas, small shrines to local gods and spirits stopped receiving offerings, not because their worshippers had been converted to new beliefs, but because younger generations found other ways to explain the phenomena their grandparents had attributed to divine intervention. The oracle at Delphi, which had been consulted by kings and philosophers for 8 centuries, gradually found its audience changing from sincere seekers of divine guidance to curious tourists and literary scholars interested in the oracle's famous ambiguity. The Pythia still delivered prophecies, but they were increasingly treated as clever wordplay rather than messages from Apollo. When the Roman Emperor Julian attempted to revive the oracle in the 4th century CE, the response he received was telling. Tell the king that the fair-wrought hall has fallen to the ground. Apollo no longer has his house, nor his mantic bay, nor his prophetic spring. The water has dried up. Even before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the practical functions that temples had served were being transferred to secular institutions. Courts of law replaced divine judgment in settling disputes. Medical schools took over the healing functions of Asclepius temples. Libraries and philosophical schools assumed the educational roles that had once been filled by priestly instruction. The great festivals that had been the heartbeat of Greek religious life gradually transformed into civic celebrations and tourist attractions. The Olympic Games continued, but increasingly emphasized athletic achievement and international competition rather than religious devotion. The dramatic festivals honoring Dionysus became occasions for artistic excellence and political commentary rather than genuine religious expression. Roman emperors, practical rulers focused on maintaining order across a vast empire, found Greek mythology more useful as cultural decoration than as governing principle. They built temples that looked Greek, but functioned more like civic centers. They supported festivals that preserved traditional forms, but served imperial rather than religious purposes. They encouraged artistic works that retold the old stories, but treated them as entertainment rather than sacred tradition. The rise of philosophical schools that offered practical wisdom for daily living provided an alternative to religious guidance that many educated people found more satisfying than traditional mythology. Stoicism taught that the universe operated according to rational principles that could be understood and accepted. Epicureanism promised happiness through reasonable pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. These philosophies offered meaning and purpose without requiring belief in anthropomorphic gods. When Christianity did become the dominant force in the late Roman Empire, it encountered a mythological system that was already in decline. The major intellectual and cultural arguments against Christianity came not from defenders of traditional Greek religion, but from philosophers who had already moved beyond anthropomorphic theology toward more abstract concepts of divinity. Christian apologists found themselves in the paradoxical position of both condemning and preserving Greek mythology. They attacked the moral content of the stories, the adultery of Zeus, the violence of Ares, the deceptions of Hermes, while maintaining classical education that required familiarity with these same narratives. Christian scholars like Augustine argued that whatever truth existed in pagan philosophy had been planted by God to prepare the world for Christian revelation. The physical destruction of temples and sacred sites when it occurred was often motivated as much by practical concerns as by religious zeal. Marble from Greek temples provided building material for Christian churches. Bronze statues of gods were melted down to create coins or weapons. Sacred groves were cleared for agricultural land. The economic value of religious sites often determined their fate more than theological considerations. But perhaps the most significant factor in the symbolic death of Greek mythology was the transformation of the stories themselves into literature rather than belief. Poets like Ovid had already begun this process during the early Roman Empire, retelling the myths with such artistic brilliance that they became primarily aesthetic rather than religious experiences. Medieval scholars preserved Greek mythological texts, not because they believed in their religious content, but because they recognized their literary and historical value. Manuscripts were copied in monasteries by monks who viewed the stories as examples of human creativity rather than divine revelation. The myths survived, but as cultural artifacts rather than living traditions. Renaissance humanists would later rediscover these preserved texts and find in them artistic inspiration and psychological insight rather than religious truth. The gods of Olympus became symbols and allegories, representing human qualities and natural forces rather than actual divine beings. A statue of Athena might represent wisdom, but few viewers expected the goddess herself to respond to prayers. This transformation from religion to literature was perhaps the most complete death a mythological system could experience. Physical destruction could create martyrs and underground revivals. Theological refutation could generate intellectual debate and renewed interest. But reducing gods to literary devices and psychological symbols made revival virtually impossible. The irony was that this literary immortality preserved the Greek gods more completely than continued religious worship might have done. Frozen in the artistic forms that poets and sculptors had given them, they became eternal in a way that religious evolution might have prevented. Zeus would always be the powerful father figure with his thunderbolts. Athena would always be the wise maiden in her armor. Apollo would always be the beautiful youth with his lyre and arrows. But they would never again be the immediate, active presences that their original worshippers had known. They had become what anthropologists call dead gods, cultural memories of what had once been living religious experiences, preserved in art and story but no longer capable of inspiring genuine religious devotion. The process took centuries to complete and was never entirely uniform across different regions and social classes. In remote areas, folk traditions preserved elements of the old religion long after urban centers had moved on to new beliefs. But by the end of the classical period, the transformation was essentially complete. Greek mythology had become what it remains today, one of humanity's greatest collections of stories about the eternal themes of love, power, ambition, and fate. Though the gods of Olympus no longer receive burnt offerings or answer prayers, their influence on human culture has proven more enduring than any temple built in their honor. In transforming from objects of worship into sources of inspiration, they achieved a kind of immortality that their original worshippers could never have imagined. The stories that once explained thunder and earthquake, love and war, have become the foundational narratives of Western civilization. Literature has been the primary vessel for this mythological survival. From the medieval period through the present day, writers have returned again and again to Greek mythological themes and characters. Dante placed mythological figures throughout his Divine Comedy, using them as symbols of human vice and virtue. Shakespeare filled his plays with classical allusions that his audiences were expected to understand. Milton's Paradise Lost draws heavily on mythological imagery to describe the war in heaven and the fall of humanity. Modern literature continues this tradition with remarkable consistency. James Joyce's Ulysses retells the Odyssey in Dublin during a single day in 1904, showing how the ancient patterns of adventure and homecoming remain relevant to contemporary experience. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series has introduced millions of young readers to Greek mythology by imagining the gods as still active in the modern world. Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad retells the Odyssey from Penelope's perspective, using mythological framework to explore contemporary questions about gender and power. The visual arts have drawn on mythological themes with equal persistence. Renaissance painters created some of their greatest masterpieces depicting scenes from Greek mythology: Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne, Rubens's numerous mythological scenes. These works weren't religious art in the traditional sense, but they used mythological subjects to explore universal themes of beauty, power, love, and loss. Modern and contemporary artists continue to find inspiration in Greek mythology. Pablo Picasso's classical period produced numerous works based on mythological themes. Salvador Dali created surrealist interpretations of mythological subjects that revealed their psychological dimensions. Contemporary artists like Anselm Kiefer and Cy Twombly have used mythological references to explore questions about civilization, destruction, and cultural memory. Psychology has perhaps provided the most influential modern interpretation of Greek mythology. Sigmund Freud used the story of Oedipus to describe fundamental patterns of human psychological development. Carl Jung argued that mythological figures represented archetypal patterns that existed in the collective unconscious of all humanity. These psychological interpretations gave the ancient stories new relevance by suggesting that they revealed timeless truths about human nature. Popular culture has embraced Greek mythology with unprecedented enthusiasm. Hollywood films from Clash of the Titans to Wonder Woman use mythological characters and themes to create modern entertainment. Video games like God of War and Assassin's Creed Odyssey allow players to interact directly with mythological figures and environments. Television series like Percy Jackson and Troy: Fall of a City bring ancient stories to contemporary audiences. The language itself preserves mythological memory in ways that most speakers don't consciously recognize. When we describe someone as having an Achilles heel, we invoke the story of the hero whose single vulnerability led to his downfall. Pandora's box has become synonymous with any action that unleashes uncontrollable consequences. A Herculean task refers to any challenge that requires extraordinary effort. Narcissistic behavior draws on the story of the youth who fell in love with his own reflection. Scientific nomenclature continues the tradition of mythological naming. Planets, moons, asteroids, and celestial phenomena bear the names of Greek and Roman gods. Elements on the periodic table honor mythological figures. Psychological conditions are named for mythological characters whose stories illustrate their symptoms. This scientific usage suggests that even in our most rational pursuits, we find mythological metaphors useful for understanding complex phenomena. Educational systems throughout the Western world continue to teach Greek mythology as essential cultural knowledge. Students learn these stories not as religious instruction, but as a keys to understanding the literary, artistic, and cultural references that permeate educated discourse. A person who doesn't know the basic stories of Greek mythology finds themselves culturally illiterate when encountering everything from classical art to contemporary advertising. The influence extends into political and social thought as well. The concept of democracy itself emerged from Greek political experimentation, and discussions of democratic ideals often reference Greek examples. The notion of hubris as a political danger, the idea that excessive pride leads to downfall, remains a standard part of political analysis. The concept of tragedy as a form of literature that explores the consequences of character flaws has shaped Western understanding of everything, from history to psychology. Modern sports culture maintains obvious connections to Greek athletic traditions. The Olympic Games explicitly invoke ancient Greek precedent and continue to be held in locations that honor that heritage. The ideal of athletic competition as a form of excellence that develops both physical and moral character derives directly from Greek educational philosophy. Even secular humanism, one of the dominant philosophical traditions of the modern West, bears strong resemblances to Greek philosophical attitudes. The emphasis on human reason as the primary tool for understanding reality, the focus on ethical behavior based on rational reflection rather than divine command, the celebration of human creative and intellectual achievement, all of these reflect values that Greek philosophers developed as alternatives to traditional religious authority. Perhaps most remarkably, Greek mythology has achieved global influence that extends far beyond the cultural boundaries of Western civilization. Japanese anime and manga frequently incorporate Greek mythological themes. Video games developed in Asia use Greek gods as characters. Fashion designers around the world create clothing lines inspired by Greek mythological figures. This global spread suggests that Greek mythology captured something universal about human experience that transcends cultural specificity. The themes of family conflict, romantic passion, political ambition, moral choice, and personal growth that drive these ancient stories remain relevant across cultures and centuries. The transformation of gods into cultural symbols has proven more powerful than their original religious function. Zeus may no longer hurl thunderbolts from Mount Olympus, but as a symbol of patriarchal authority, he influences countless stories about fathers and children, leaders and followers, power and responsibility. Athena may no longer guide heroes in battle, but as a symbol of wisdom and strategic thinking, she continues to inspire anyone who values intelligence over force. In becoming legendary rather than divine, the Greek gods achieved a form of immortality that transcends the rise and fall of any particular religious system. They have become part of the permanent heritage of human imagination, available to each generation to rediscover and reinterpret according to their own needs and understanding. As we reach the end of this journey through the twilight of the Greek gods, we find ourselves confronting a truth that extends far beyond ancient history. All human beliefs, no matter how powerful or enduring they seem, exist within the flow of time and change. The gods who once commanded absolute devotion from millions of worshippers have become characters in stories we tell for entertainment and education. The temples that once stood as eternal monuments to divine glory now exist primarily as tourist destinations and archaeological sites. But this transformation from religion to legend doesn't represent failure or defeat. Instead, it reveals something profound about the relationship between human consciousness and the stories we use to make sense of existence. The Greek gods didn't die. They evolved into something that might be even more powerful than their original religious form, permanent residents of human imagination. Consider what this means for our own time and our own beliefs. The ideologies that seem unshakable today, the celebrities who dominate our attention, the institutions that appear permanent, all of these exist within the same cycles of rise and decline that affected the Olympian gods. Democracy itself, perhaps the most successful political export of Greek civilization, continues to evolve and face challenges that its creators never anticipated. Yet the stories we tell about democracy, about individual rights, about the value of questioning authority, about the importance of reason and evidence in making decisions. These stories carry forward essential insights that transcend any particular political system. Like the mythological stories of Greek gods, our contemporary narratives about freedom and justice may one day seem as distant as Zeus and Athena do to us, but the human values they preserve will likely find new expressions in forms we cannot yet imagine. The process we've witnessed, the gradual transformation of living religion into cultural memory, continues around us today. Traditional religious practices adapt to technological change and cultural evolution. New forms of spiritual seeking emerge to address needs that established institutions don't meet. The boundaries between entertainment and meaning, between virtual and real, between individual and community, continue to shift in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Perhaps most importantly, the Greek mythological legacy suggests that human beings have an extraordinary capacity to preserve what matters most about their cultural achievements, even as the surface forms of those achievements change beyond recognition. The values of courage, wisdom, justice, and love that the Greek gods embodied survive in new stories, new symbols, new institutions. The heroes who risked everything to protect the innocent live on in every person who chooses to stand up against injustice. The artists who created beauty that outlasted empires live on in every creator who believes that aesthetic achievement matters. The philosophers who insisted that truth was worth pursuing, regardless of where it led, live on in every researcher, every journalist, every citizen who values facts over convenient fictions. In this sense, the gods never left. They simply took up residence inside human hearts and minds, where they continue to inspire and challenge and guide, but in ways that respect human autonomy rather than demanding blind obedience. Zeus's concern for justice lives on in everyone who insists that laws should apply equally to all people. Athena's wisdom guides everyone who tries to think clearly about complex problems. Apollo's devotion to truth motivates everyone who creates art that illuminates rather than deceives. The great lesson of Greek mythology's transformation may be that the most important human achievements become immortal, not by resisting change, but by adapting to it, not by demanding permanent reverence, but by proving permanently useful. The stories that survive are those that continue to offer insight into the fundamental challenges of human existence. How do we use power responsibly? How do we love without possessing? How do we face mortality with dignity? How do we create meaning in an uncertain universe? These questions remain as urgent today as they were 3,000 years ago, when Greek poets first told stories about gods and heroes grappling with the same fundamental dilemmas. The specific forms of the challenges change. We worry about artificial intelligence rather than divine anger, about environmental destruction rather than cosmic chaos, about global inequality rather than divine favoritism. But the underlying human need to find purpose and direction remains constant. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider that you are part of this continuing story. The beliefs that guide your life, the values that inform your choices, the hopes that sustain you through difficulty, all of these are part of humanity's ongoing attempt to create meaning in a universe that doesn't come with instruction manuals. Your own myths may not involve gods and heroes in the classical sense, but they serve the same function that Greek mythology served for its believers, helping you understand your place in the larger story of existence, giving you models for how to behave when facing impossible choices, reminding you that your individual life is connected to something larger and more enduring than yourself. The gods of Olympus have become part of the permanent furniture of human imagination, available to anyone who needs reminders about the complexity and beauty of existence. They continue to teach the lessons they always taught: that power without wisdom is dangerous, that love without respect is destructive, that courage without justice is mere violence, that life without meaning is unbearable. In their transformation from objects of worship to sources of inspiration, they have perhaps achieved the kind of immortality they always deserved, not as distant rulers demanding submission, but as eternal companions in humanity's ongoing effort to understand what it means to be conscious, creative, mortal beings in an infinite cosmos. Sleep well, knowing that the stories that have sustained human imagination for 3 millennia remain available to sustain your own journey through the mysteries and wonders of existence.